I think over the past few Yu-Gi-Oh! Discussions I've done, it's been made abundantly clear that I really enjoy talking about cards that came from the anime. As someone who fell in love with the series through the anime, I find it really fun to look back at the cards that haven't been released yet, or recently were released, and especially trying to find uses for those cards. Most of these releases have come from the Animation Chronicles. But prior to that, we had the collection packs, which basically served the same purpose, but with a different name since they were running alongside the animes. However, with the main series ending with Reigns, Konami decided to rebrand the set, and did a few slight tweaks to how they chose cards for them, before fucking everything up in 2023. Before that, however, Konami decided to do one final send-off for the set, where, earlier in that year, Konami held a vote in order to decide which archetype got included in it. The poll ran for about a week, and there were 12 themes to choose from, with 2 from each series, and all but one of them originated from the anime. By the end of it all, Fossils won out, and was released in that following collection pack alongside Numeron and Appliancer, though it wasn't the only one printed as we soon saw. However, several of the other archetypes included in this poll still haven't been printed, so I thought it'd be a fun thing to talk about. I won't be going over each individual card in this like I do with other videos, but I may do it for smaller archetypes that I don't have as much to say about. So, with that said, let's go down the list of all the candidates. In first place, we have the winner of the vote, Fossils, and this is both an unsurprising outcome and one I'm very happy about. Something that will become very evident as we go through the top 4 archetypes is that they are all used by major characters in their respective series. And while Jim isn't as big as some of the other characters we'll see, he was still a major supporting character, and at the very least had an archetype people really wanted to see printed. Being one of the 4 transfer students in GX, he spent well over a decade being the only one whose deck never got printed, most likely because the idea of printing Fossil Fusion was something Konami was terrified about. For those unaware, Fossil Fusion is a spell card that lets you fusion summon by banishing monsters from either graveyard, which was likely deemed too strong back in 2006, so they never gave us these cards till we told them we were ready for it. But thanks for the cries of the community, Konami has finally given it to us, and the results have been pretty underwhelming. Okay, I say this as someone who really likes this deck, but Fossil feels pretty mediocre when all things are considered. There's multiple reasons for this, but the big 2 are that several of their fusions are very underwhelming and only really exist to be dumped from the extra deck, and more frustrating, this archetype has very few main deck monsters, with only 3, and only one of them you really want to play. I hope this doesn't sound like Fossil wasn't deserving of being in first place, because I believe it absolutely was. It just feels like the deck wasn't done the justice that it deserved. I hope we can see some legacy support for this deck in the near future, or even them printing some of the remaining cards, but where it currently stands, I feel Fossil isn't up to the quality I would have expected from the first place archetype. The second place archetype is Sun Avalon from Reigns, and this is another one that you guys are probably familiar with. Aside from being the most playable of the archetypes printed, it was also used by a major character in Reigns, though this has made me realize that prior to Spectre's deck being added, none of Revolver's lieutenants had their archetypes printed, and 5 years after the poll we still don't have Motor Worms, Helix, or Dark Mummy. Man, I don't know what it is with Konami and refusing to print Reigns archetypes, but this series seriously shouldn't have as many unreleased decks as it does. As for what Sun Avalon does, it's basically a major engine in Plant Link, being able to put a ton of bodies on board thanks to Sunseed Genus Loci, which is actually a normal monster that interacts with a lot of their powerful cards, such as allowing Dryas to search a spell card, or being revived by many of their cards. And being a normal monster actually means it paired very well with Unexpected Die and the Primate cards, so being a normal monster isn't even an issue. What helps the deck is the various good plant support it has, from the Aromas to the Rickas to generic stuff like Lonefire Blossom, all allowing for it to be a strong combo deck which has made it very popular among players. Now granted, this wasn't how the deck was received at first, and in fact it was only really super popular in Europe for a long while, partly due to not having a really good end boss, but also simply because the deck is extremely difficult to play, making it very unforgiving for new players. But eventually, with some newer support, as well as players dedicating themselves to figuring out the strat, Sun Avalon ended up becoming more and more successful, leading it to topping multiple events, and even finished in the top 8 of the World Championship in 2023. And as a result of it finally seeing the love and success that it deserved, the deck was hit with a limit to 2 of its cards in the following ban list. How did a deck that only made it to quarterfinals get harder than a deck that won? That frustrating balancing choice aside, Sun Avalon has gotten what Fossil could only have dreamed of. It's missing a few cards and could do with some legacy support, but unlike Fossil, which has the lack of results to warrant that request, Sun Avalon has been able to top despite missing the cards, and heck, even with the limits, it has continued to top in some places. So while it may not have been the archetype the majority of people wanted, it's still a welcome addition to the game. In third place, we have the only manga archetype to appear on the poll, Wicked God, which isn't entirely accurate. See, when it says Wicked God as an archetype, it's actually just referring to a bunch of cards used by Yaeko Tenma in Yu-Gi-Oh! R, rather than a named archetype. And as a result, most people didn't even realize this series did get printed. Since the poll, we've had 6 of Yaeko's cards printed, free in Premium Pack, and free as V-Jump subscription cards, as well as one of Yugi's cards that was tweaked to work with Wicked Gods. Most people probably don't even realize that these are supposed to be the Wicked God cards since none of them mention them by name, but these are the cards we would be getting. The poll said Yaeko Tenma's Wicked Gods, and the Wicked Gods were out before the poll, so the only thing it could have been are some of the unprinted cards, which these are. And the results of these cards has been very lackluster, as in they're not good. Despite being designed to support the Wicked Gods, most of them are just made to reference the manga, with only Angel 01 and Tellus really doing anything that could be considered helpful. Divine Evolution is also helpful, but the rest of the cards don't do anything to help the gods. Honestly, if they wanted a unifying theme to work with the Wicked Gods, it just makes me wonder why we didn't get Seraphim instead, as well as the fairy cards he used. And to be honest, I think it would have been more interesting archetype-wise if the main deck cards to get the Wicked Gods were all fairies, while the gods were all fiends. Of the 3 archetypes that got released, Wicked Gods was easily the one that got the least love and attention given to it. And that's a massive shame because it was really cool to see a manga archetype on the poll and actually make it to the top quarter. I just wish the end result was better. Now we're into the real meat of the video, with the archetypes that haven't had any cards for them released at all. Mostly. And the 4th one is one that I'm shocked Konami hasn't tried releasing earlier. Drones. Used in variants by Tumblr's Sexy Man Blood Shepherd, Drones is a deck based around, well, drones. Machines that focus on link climbing, as well as having access to fusion and synchros. And being an archetype based on drones, their overarching gimmick is that they can attack directly, with several of their cards allowing you to do so. I've also seen some people saying that they're a deck that pluses off of being negated, which is why they haven't been printed yet, but unless I'm missing something, the only one that does that is the Synchro. I actually think Drone is a funny one for me to talk about, given something I mentioned in a previous video. I said that Scrap Garage is a good card, but would need something like a Machine Link deck to be really amazing, and well, here's Drone basically being Machine Link. Sure, all of the links require specifically drone monsters to make them, but drone would likely become the core of this possible strategy, similar to how Sun Avalon did in Plant Link. And that's even before considering pairing them with Mecha Phantom Beast to make use of their synchros, as well as all the tokens to link climb, and wow, this sounds really promising. So really, the question is, why didn't it win? And well, the simple answer is that Fossils and Sun Avalon had more reason to be printed. And while I could see drones beating Wicked Gods, it being tied to the big bad of ARP is probably what made it more appealing, to the point that it got 5 more % than drones on the poll. Okay, now that raises another question. Why haven't we gotten drones since then? We got G-Golem and Allure Queen before it, and looking at these archetypes gives us the answer. G-Golem had a few cards that could be printed, and got everything except the trap, and Allure Queen only had 3 cards. Drones, just counting the monsters, has 14 cards that could be printed, with an additional 14 spells and traps that can be printed. 28 total cards. That's as much as we've been getting in modern Animation Chronicles sets. This is likely a similar reason as to why things like Storm Riders, Armatos Legios, and other bigger archetypes haven't been getting printed. There's too much, and Konami doesn't want to make the hard choices as to what should and shouldn't be printed, outside of a few outliers, which sucks because it means it's gonna take way longer than it should for this deck to be printed, and it shouldn't be like that. Drones should have been printed years ago. We should be discussing if drones are gonna get a Link 4, not if they're even gonna come out. I do hope that we get these sooner rather than later because it is a neat deck, and hey, maybe they'll do it just to put Blood Shepherd in Duel Links. But until we see Battle Drone General on the cover of Animation Chronicles, all we can do is cope. Taking 5th was the other GX archetype we had on the vote, Doll Parts. and it's the first of these archetypes that was used by a one-off character most people probably forgot about. Alice the Living Doll played a strange deck based around sending doll parts to the graveyard, then getting them onto the field. Doll parts being normal monsters with 0 attack and defense. The end goal of this was that you would summon out this monstrosity called Doll Chimera, which gained 400 attack for each part in the graveyard and can protect itself by bidding 2 parts. There's also another one which gains 1000 for every 4 parts in the graveyard. So what we have here is a deck based around summoning a low attack monster that increases its attack while there are multiples of a specific 0 stat, 1 star normal monster in the graveyard. Wait a minute. Yeah, this is literally just Skull Servants but as spellcasters, which to be fair, I don't think is as much of an improvement. Skull Servants aren't meta or anything, and they don't need to be since they're a funny OTK deck, but being a zombie deck means it's helped immensely due to all the amazing generic zombie support, while Doll Parts to my knowledge doesn't have any amazing spellcaster support for it, and even if it did, it's hurt by the fact that Doll Chimera needs to be special summoned by a spell card. That being said, there was something interesting I found while looking through these cards, as while they don't have generic spellcaster support that aids them greatly, they are supported by another archetype that is coincidentally based around 0 attack point normal monsters, that being Doll Monster. The coincidence of these two decks having a similar playstyle was strange enough, but it is made even stranger when you realize that these are both decks used by living dolls brought to life, and both had a horror-themed boss monster. I highly doubt that this was done on purpose and is probably just a coincidence because of creepy dolls being a common trope, but throwing Doll Happiness and Box of Friends into a future Doll Parts deck is probably going to be a common thing unless they change the parts to be effect monsters. Honestly, I was kind of wondering why this got so high given the theme and gameplay style are done better by other decks, but I'm guessing this is sort of a 2 cakes situation. It's not replacing or being replaced by things like Doll Parts or Gimmick Puppets, it's just another deck for those people to maybe enjoy, even if it's still vastly overshadowed by the Skeleton Wars. Then again, the other reason might be because a lot of the other decks below it are ones that are very undesirable, and this was the best of the mid things thrown on the poll, which is definitely more than I can say for Thorn Prisoner. I'm gonna be upfront, I don't like these cards. Thorn Prisoner is a torture-themed deck with several of their monsters trapped in torture devices by vines, and half of them look very phallic, because apparently someone on the design team really wanted a fetish archetype to be printed. You know, it's probably that or the fucking force-feeding archetype. The gimmick of the deck is that you pay life points for some of their effects and try to make their synchro so you can then go into their fusion, which has a kind of confusing effect on first read, but in short, functions similar to Kentragina. The basic idea of this deck is to inflict pain onto yourself to allow you to kill your opponent, but it falls apart because a lot of their cards are kind of shit. It's a lot of weak battle related effects that still have you getting your shit kicked in, and any halfway decent deck will either OTK you through these or remove these guys in main phase 1. But having mediocre effects isn't even the worst of it, because Thorn Prisoners is a special case where it actually got worse after the poll was released for an interesting reason. The deck is based around paying life points for effects and using your guys to make synchros and fusions, then getting your big guy to a ton of attack to swing for game. And if you're familiar with the game, you're probably realizing that there's another archetype that this description also describes, that being Punk. And the moment you start comparing the two, things start looking really bad for Thorn Prisoner. Punk has some great starters, but also has a very good variety of plays, be it making Rising Carp to set up Dragon, or using your 2/3s or 2/8s to make Xyz monsters. Thorn Prisoner has no starters, and makes a level 2 synchro to attempt to set up some plays after you get your shit kicked in. Punk has an extremely good finisher in Psychic and Punisher, which not only gets a ton of attack, but is also unaffected by your opponent's stuff while you're behind and can even be removal. Thorn Prisoner makes a guy who does nothing but gets a ton of attack, whose peak is still less than Access Code Talker. Punk's visual design is one of the best in the entire series, with cards like Jam Dragon Drive being up there for some of the best card arts in the entire game, while Thorn Prisoner's art is only notable because the guys looks like dicks. Honestly, the phallic design is probably why this took the 6th place, because comedy, since these cards offer nothing on their own. This is easily my least favorite archetype on the poll, and why was it even on the poll? It's not even like you need to dig to find a good Arc 5 archetype to print here, because the guy who used Thorn Prisoner ditched the deck for a more interesting deck that wasn't printed at the time, being Earthbound Servants. And while they aren't great, Servants ended up being a fan favorite deck after it released. which makes me wonder why they didn't even put it on the poll. Arc 5 has some amazing card design, and I'm happy it's getting a ton of support printed recently, but this is one deck I'd rather not see released anytime soon. At lucky number 7, we have Ninja, which has had multiple different types in the series, including the well-known flip variant used by Moonshadow in Arc 5, but the ones we have for this poll are the ones used in DM by Jean-Claude Magnum. I don't know what's more surprising, the fact that they considered this clown for this, or the fact that it got picked over Armor. But to honestly give a bit of credit, I didn't realize there was actually a decent amount of cards in this archetype, 7 in total, which actually puts it above Thorn Prisoners and most of the archetypes below it in terms of cards that could be printed. Granted, 2 of these are normal monsters and one of them just ends the battle phase, but hey, don't doubt the Primite synergy. As for the rest of the ninjas, the commanders can special summon a ninja on summon, with Kabuki being able to special summon one from deck, which is kinda sick, all to set up the summon of Ninja Master Shogun, who summons more guys when he's summoned. Basically, it's a deck made to summon a ton of warriors. It's like 6 Samurai, but not as insane. Kinda feels like a Zexal archetype to be honest, with all the summoning. And there is an Xyz Ninja archetype from Zexal, but none of these guys line up level-wise to make any of those guys. There's also link climbing you can do, but again, 6 Samurai does that way better. The most likely thing that will happen is that these will be merged with Moonshadow's Flip Ninjas, since that tends to be the most successful form of ninja card around. Though, to be honest, this does kinda make it clear as to why these didn't make the top half of the list. We're bursting at the seams with ninja-related cards that these guys clearly don't have anything interesting to offer to make them worth picking over other things. I'm not entirely against printing them, but you're gonna need to make a really good argument as to why they're worth printing over something like Armor. Coming in 8th place, we have Yomi, also known as Abyss, which was used by the familiar of Red Nova.
Who?
Okay, so 5 of these is probably the core series I have the least knowledge on, so I'm not too familiar with the characters' archetypes that could have been printed. So from what I'm understanding, there aren't that many full-on archetypes left in 5Ds to print it, so that's why this was likely chosen. Even though there are multiple manga archetypes that could have been chosen, although I do like the little firearms design. Also yes, this is the first 5Ds archetypes we are talking about, meaning 5Ds nearly went 2/3 of the poll before they got their first archetype. I guess congrats that you didn't make it bottom 4. The gimmick of Yomi is that it's a fiend deck based around doing burn damage when the guys are destroyed, and applying an additional effect along with it. There's also a guy who banishes free to summon himself and pops a card, then burns for 600, and a trap to summon a guy, but that's it. Outside of 2 other cards that are unrelated. There's very little to work with here, other than them being fiends that plus when destroyed like Unchained. But they're hardly the only ones that do that. I was originally going to talk about how these could be reworked into Earthbound Servants since they are literally used by a servant of the Earthbound god Red Nova, and we even got Red Nova as a card, but there's no tuners here. And none of them really benefit from being used as fusion or synchro material. I guess they could be turned into a tribute engine for the Immortals, which is fitting since Treeborn Frog is technically part of the archetype, but I don't think they'll be doing that. Not hard to see why this wasn't giving much attention, and to be honest, I'm struggling to come up with things to say about it. So you know how I mentioned it would be embarrassing for Yomi to be in the bottom 3 since it was 5D's first archetype? Well, if you were paying attention, you'd realize that there is one series we haven't mentioned yet, that being Zexal, with both of its archetypes making the bottom 4. The first of those being Shamans in 9th place. These were an archetype used by Fortuno, and if you're familiar with Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime stuff, that should set off some alarms. See, Fortuno is probably one of the most well-known jobber characters in the series due to the fact that he played both Big Eye and Shockmaster, 2 of the most powerful Xyz monsters for their time, and the latter of which is still banned to this day. So naturally, with such powerful and cool Xyz monsters at his disposal, he of course played a rather slow Xyz deck. The 3 color shamans all drag 1 out from your hand when your opponent plays a certain card, while Rainbow is just Cyber Dragon, but it requires your opponent to control an Xyz. There's also Shaman Call, which summons a low level shaman from deck if you control 2 spellcasters with 0 attack, and Xyz Plant, which summons itself as a monster with the same level as a monster you control. Oh, and there's 3 dance spell trap cards which tie into the shaman theming, but 2 of those are floodgates, so fuck them. It's not hard to see why this ended up being so low on the vote. It's a very slow Xyz spam deck whose boss monsters are either in better decks, or aren't around. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't open to seeing what could possibly be done with these cards, since I do find the theming neat, but they're gonna need to put in a lot of work to justify it. In 10th place, we have Gutsmaster, the second Arc 5 archetype. This was used by Zuzu's father and is a sports-themed Fire Warrior deck. It's based around swarming the field as well as battle tricks as shown by 2 of their 3 monsters, with both of them sharing the ability to special summon a Gutsmaster from hand once per turn. The third one, meanwhile, does have an effect, but it's currently unknown and no one has tried to decipher what the card does since, well, it's Gutsmaster, no one cares. Though I assume it shares the special summon effect. There's also 2 really mid spell cards. One of them is literally just a worse Eye of Truth, and they also have a spell that is Pot of Greed, but your opponent gets the cards you draw, then you get to add 2 cards from their hand to yours, but then you give each other back the cards during the end phase. Also, you can't special summon monsters with the same names as the cards you added. Yeah, kinda crazy, not gonna lie. Honestly, these feel like battle in boxes at home with the battle focus and Fire Warrior theming, and that could be part of the reason why they rank so low. Sure, being Fire Warrior helps by giving them generic support like Durandal and King Dempsey, but we already have several Fire Warrior decks to play with, and we also already have several sports themed decks, so this isn't really offering anything new that we don't have. Also, you may have noticed that this deck doesn't really have any sort of win condition due to lacking any sort of boss monster. So despite it not being designed to be one, this kinda just feels like a really bad rank 4 deck. And we just talked about that with Shaman, so it's no surprise that this one didn't get any attention. Taking the silver medal for sucking, we have Debuggers in 11th place, and there's not much to talk about. They're level 3 light machines that when normal summon, bring out one of the other Debuggers if you have the third one on field. We've somehow made cards simpler than Shaman, without anything interesting to make people want to release them, unless you're one of those people who really likes Crash Bugs since they're basically their sister archetype. Which makes it even funnier that we got their boss monster last year. Yeah, well before several of the other archetypes, Debugger and the deck that I also got 12th had their boss monsters printed, in this case it being Antidote Nurse, who was likely chosen as it could be decked into Goblin Bikers. But then why not just print the whole archetype at that point? There's only 3 cards left, surely we could have included them in this set. Maybe these will have some interesting changes made when they do finally release, but I think it's very clear as to why they weren't. And finally, in dead last, 12th place, we have the Wheel archetype from 5D, and I'm not surprised at this result. This was an archetype used by a literal Who of a character consisting of 3 monsters whose entire theme is based around wheels. He did use 2 other unreleased cards that will likely be made part of the archetype, but I don't think it's any surprise that people weren't interested in these cards at all. Really, the only notable thing about this archetype, aside from it coming dead last in the poll, is that we did eventually get the Synchro Monster Combat Wheel, which was the last Synchro Monster from 5Ds to be printed. But I think that says more about how little this card was wanted than anything else. And with that, we've covered all the candidates for the collection pack poll. And man, there were some stinkers. Like sure, we had some fun discussions going on earlier, but as we got further down the list, it became harder and harder to really say anything about some of these decks because their playstyle was so basic. Hell, I didn't even talk about the playstyle of Wheel because there wasn't one. And honestly makes me wonder how someone at Konami thought these archetypes would get any votes to begin with. And I think that's the thing.
Truth is, the game was rigged from the start.
Now, I'm not saying it was actually rigged or anything, but I do think that this poll was kind of set up so Konami got the archetypes it wanted to win. Fossil, Sun Avalon Drone, and Wicked God all made sense to be on the poll, the popular decks that would easily get votes when given the choice. But Shaman? Gutsmaster? Wheel? No one cares about these decks, and most people probably haven't even heard of them. Why were some of these chosen over decks people clearly wanted? Where was Armor, Servants, Clear World, New Order? Fuck, I think the only series that didn't have any major misses when it came to its archetypes was Vrains. There was no way any of these lesser decks could have won the poll when going against the bigger archetypes. And honestly, I don't think the bigger ones should have been on there to begin with. Like no shit printing Fossils, Drone, or Sun Avalon makes sense. They were likely going to be printed anyway. Give us more pack filler to put on these polls to make it more interesting. If we ever get another poll, I want it to be full of the shit that wouldn't stand a chance against real decks. Just terrible archetypes that are being given the golden opportunity to be printed as chosen by the community. Now, this will never happen, but I think it would be a fun idea. I doubt we will ever see this happen again, but if it did, you can be damn sure I'll be watching to see what happens. Anyway, since the last bottom 2 archetypes got printed, I'm expecting Gutsmasters to be printed this year. My name is Era, and thank you for listening to this funny story from Yu-Gi-Oh's history.